Well, hello. We're here for the pastor's study, and we're looking at the Benedict option. That is the book, one of the books that we've been reading. We're reading two others. I'll mention those in a minute. In chapter 6, the author of the Benedict option examines the idea of a Christian village, really the idea of community. And community in this chapter is household or family in a household, congregation, and then the larger Christian community. Now, in Strangers in a Strange Land, the Archbishop of Philadelphia explains that the church in the next 20 years will be very different, or should be different, than it has been. Must return to being a family of families, separated from the culture, but present in it as a community of the faithful. So I want you to read chapter 10 of Strangers in a Strange Land, along with the 6th chapter of the Benedict option. And then in the book Out of the Ashes, the author of this book uses chapters 5 and 6 to address rediscovering manhood and womanhood, which is a critical aspect for seeing the home as central to the plan and will of God for his people. So I want you to read those chapters as well. So 5 and 6 from this book, chapter 10 from this book, and then, of course, we're in chapter 6 of the Benedict option, which is what I'm going to talk about now. Now, my view of community is that it involves a sense of identity and belonging, which is expressed as kinship. Now, we think of kinship in three ways: blood relatives, and then legal relatives, those who we're in-laws or adopted. And then there is a category called fictive relatives. These are people who function like an uncle or like a mom or like a brother. And in many cultures, these are very important relationships. In our culture, they're almost treated as if you have an imaginary friend. But the reality is, the biblical priority is that fictive relationships, in some sense, are more important than blood and legal. I'll give you an example. Jesus says, if you don't hate your father and mother and your wife and your brother and sister more than me, if you love them more than me, you're not worthy of me. Now, that relationship that we have with him is a spiritual, fictive relationship. It's not a blood relative. He's not a legal or adopted relative. It's lordship based, and it's the role he plays towards us as Lord and our role as servant. And he places that above others. The Bible seems to indicate that our relationship with fellow believers at times and often will override blood relatives and legal relatives. So it's important to understand that. It's very hard for Americans to catch that. So community involves this sense of having an identity and belonging with a group of people on this spiritual, fictive, relational context. But it also is about the relational roles that we play with each other, with back and forth with each other. Our roles in the home: father, mother, parent, in that sense, child, husband and wife. Our roles that we function in the congregation, which is pastoral roles, deacon roles, teacher roles, musician roles, all of these things are based on our gifting, our level of maturity, and our recognition by the community that that's the part that we play within the body. So this sense of belonging and identity, these relational rules, and finally, relational roles, and then finally, relational rules. And for us, these are the commandments of God summarized into three great commandments: loving God, which is about holiness, identification with God; loving our fellow man, which is, or fellow human, which is the second great commandment, the love your neighbor as yourself, which is about goodness. And then the final one, Jesus said, I give you a new commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. And this commandment will show that you are my disciples if you love one another. That's about unity. So we are to walk in the commandments of God. All the commandments in the Older and New Testaments fit under those three categories of loving God, our relationship to God. These are the relational rules. Our fellow man, these are the relational rules. And then our fellow believer, these are the relational rules. And the level of those is different, but the idea that we have been given relational rules is part of that notion. So we have to acknowledge our belonging to community and then act within our roles and manifest the relational rules that have been given to us as God. This is becoming more and more important because our culture is atomizing with this radical individualism, fragmenting into groups that uh, uh, see themselves as opposed to other groups. And so there's a loss of community and a loss of the biblical worldview in the church as we're pulled by these things. We and our children are under incredible, just incredible pressure to assimilate into this culture. And if we do, the faith will be damaged. So in this chapter, he wants to talk about the household, and specifically, he says that we should make our homes into a domestic monastery. Interesting term, not a term that all believers would catch. What he means is that the home must have an atmosphere and a structure and an order that is intentionally religious, that intentionally follows this sense of identity, this sense of roles, and this sense of rules. Now, my view is that the home is the outpost of the kingdom of God. I believe the congregation is the embassy of the kingdom of God, but the home is the outpost of the kingdom of God. It's the farthest edge out here. And when you when you come into a home of a Jew or a Christian, you actually leave the nature and culture that is outside and enter into the kingdom of God. And therefore, the home must have markers of the faith. That would be the mezuzah, or in Catholic homes, it might be a crucifix. In Protestant homes, it might be a cross, or it might be a coffee table Bible. Those things that indicate that this is a religious home. It must have times of prayer and worship, which would include the holy days and life cycle rituals. And the members of the family must follow the biblical family roles and the commandments. Now, he warns us against the idealization of the family. Families are not perfect, but the goals of struggling to be a biblical family is very important. This is not forced conformity, but a struggle to practice the presence of God and community with one another in the home. But he goes beyond the household as well and says that we have to be careful about compartmentalization of the home and the congregation from the rest of our life. And he really points out that this means that your children's friends matter. If the majority of their friends are not believers, if they spend most of their time in a non-religious reinforcing environment, that will have an effect on them. And so to address this, he argues that members of congregations should live near each other and interact with each other for that reinforcement. This is becoming more and more important. Household connections within a congregation are really important. For the most part, when you come to a worship service, you're not interacting with the other people. So you have to be in their homes and they have to be in yours. And that's geographical. That's why I've suggested that the disciple center families connect with those who reside near them and that they interact in their homes. We're spread out over two large counties, and geography does have an effect on community. So sharing Sabbath together or gathering after a Lord's Day service or a Holy Day service allows us to reinforce community and stay connected within our roles and according to God's commands. But these relationships, as he points out, have to be authentic and flexible. They can't be this enforced just conformity to give the appearance that we're doing this. So we have to learn to trust each other in this process, allowing for growth, allowing for flexibility, so that we can become close to each other, not in an emotional sense, though that's fine, but more in a matter that there's a value shared base that we can trust one another. Now, beyond the congregation is important because the household and the congregation are critical institutions of community. And they're the primary focus of biblical attention, but they're not the full sum of community. You have fellow believers in your extended family. You have fellow believers at your workplace. You have fellow believers at school. And there are believers in your neighborhoods and in the interest groups that you attend. That you attend in maybe going to the gym, or you belong to a martial arts group, or a golf forum, whatever that is. Many of these believers are from different traditions or denominations, and that's actually good. We must be multi-denominational in our communal relationships. There's much for us to learn in multi-denominational contexts and in interfaith relationships between Jews and Christians. Now, in the last 50 to 70 years, non-denominationalism has changed from being a cooperative ministry. In the beginning, the word non-denominational meant that a ministry like Youth for Christ or Campus Crusade or the Navigators or any of these organizations were non-denominational. That meant if you were Catholic or you were Methodist or you were Baptist or you were Lutheran, you could participate because they weren't going to get into the denominational differences. They were going to address the things that we had in common. So non-denominational really was not without denomination, but denominations working together. But that has changed now to where non-denominational, in some sense, means that people are ignorant or dismissive of other traditions. Too many Christians only know what other groups believe or do that is wrong. That's our apologetic approach. But we should know what the others do or believe that is correct and useful, even if it's different than our tradition. So we need to move together in common areas of faith and practice and appreciate our differences in emphasis. And where there is real and significant differences, simply follow our own conscience and the tradition as we have been taught, not judging one another. We are seeking unity, not uniformity. And that unity is relational and spiritual, not doctrinal and practice, at least on the peripheral aspects of the faith. So the author ends his discussion with the advice that we are not to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. All or nothing idealists usually have terrible relationships. They think they're uncompromising, but they're not about compromising. They're about having it their way. And it's either all or nothing in that. But the biblical faith is a wrestling with God and a wrestling with our fellow human beings and a wrestling with those within the faith by attempting to trust God and obey God that his ways are right. And as we struggle to do that, we are actually wrestling with our flesh, with the world culture, and with satanic influences. So the Judeo-Christian village is a dynamic of local community, of those who trust the God of Israel through his Messiah, and who cling to the promises of God that will one day come into full manifestation. And while the world is not our home, we await the kingdom to come, where the poor in spirit will inherit the earth. So the idea is that we must reinforce our homes, where the faith is learned. We'll talk about this next time. Then we must reinforce the congregations, where healthy homes gather together to be reinforced. And then we must go out and be salt and light in our relationships with the rest of the world, knowing that there are fellow believers in all of those corners of the world, and we need to know them, we need to understand them, and we need to cooperate with them. Practicing the presence of God and the communion of saints. It does take a village in that sense, because our children need to grow up with that dynamic and local community functioning so that they are reinforced and formed appropriately. We'll talk about that next week when we look at education as Christian formation. Until then, we'll see you later.